Before it was a distillery, it was a settlement. And before it was a settlement, it was a frontier wilderness, a land lush with sprawling meadows, virgin forests of white oak, ash, and wild cherry trees, and formidable palisades carved by ancient rivers. Remote and untouched, it was a land whose stillness was a constant song of tranquility. It was the buffalo, however, that ultimately broke the silence of this wilderness, not only with the thunder of its massive herds, but with the thousands of miles of trails it trampled, trails that led pioneers and settlers alike westward. One such trail led to the rugged banks of what is now called the Kentucky River. It was here, just a short distance from Kentucky's state capital of today, that millions of buffalo found passage across the river in their move toward the Great Plains. And it was here that they left a rough, wide clearing that would become a gateway to a new frontier, to a new settlement, and ultimately to the home of the Buffalo Trace Distillery. Commemorating the site of this great crossing, the Buffalo Trace Distillery embraces the heritage created by brave pioneers, hopeful settlers, and Kentucky's native sons who left their marks as legends, heroes, and leaders. Their legacies still echo through the century-old warehouses, and their spirits still stir the winds that sweep along the river, alternately cooling and warming the ruby-hued treasures sleeping in handmade oak barrels. Today, Buffalo Trace quietly produces finely crafted bourbon. Yet more than 200 years ago on this very site, legends such as Daniel Boone and George Rogers Clark braved frontier dangers to find new lands and new adventures. In 1775, brothers Hancock and Willis Lee established the settlement of Leestown with a small company of men. Leestown was the Commonwealth's first settlement north of the Kentucky River, and the Lees group struggled to survive in a wilderness that was as rugged as their souls. In 1776, Indian raids coupled with the advent of the American Revolution nearly extinguished the settlement forever. But the Buffalo Trace continued to bring more pioneers westward. By 1789, the ancient Buffalo Crossing was bustling with activity as Leestown became a key stop along the Buffalo Trace in the Kentucky River. A brisk traffic in distilled spirits had begun, and Leestown's warehouses stored many a barrel of Kentucky whiskey. Soon, a distillery was built on the site, thus marking the beginning of what would become Buffalo Trace's long history as a pioneering and innovative leader in the bourbon industry. The first modern distillery was built here in 1857. It was the first U.S. distillery to incorporate the use of steam power, a major advance in producing high-quality whiskey. The distillery later was purchased and further modernized by E.H. Taylor, Jr., known as one of Kentucky's original bourbon aristocrats. Taylor was an industry leader who greatly advanced the quality of Kentucky's bourbon and safeguarded the bourbon label from bogus producers. By 1886, the distillery had introduced the nation's first climate-controlled warehousing for aging whiskey and was known around the world for producing America's finest spirits. The distillery remained a top producer well into the 1900s, but was threatened when Prohibition was enacted in 1920. Fortunately, it was one of the 4 distilleries in the United States to continue distillation during Prohibition. With a government permit, the distillery was allowed to produce limited bottlings of whiskey for medicinal purposes, helping to keep its doors open until repeal in 1933. Despite the setbacks of Prohibition and the Great Flood of 1937, the distillery rebounded and flourished under the guidance of Colonel Albert Blanton. Blanton was a bourbon aristocrat in the mold of E.H. Taylor and the great whiskey men of the 1800s. He took pride in the distillery as well as its products. In 1934, he designed and built the stately Stony Point Mansion, which overlooks the distillery grounds. And today, visitors and distillery employees alike enjoy the beauty of the distillery clubhouse, constructed with logs from century-old cabins, and an open courtyard and gardens designed by Blanton. Blanton, born and raised on a farm adjacent to the distillery, was a bourbon traditionalist at heart. For himself and a few select friends, he occasionally produced and bottled a single-barrel bourbon, much the same way as Kentucky's earliest bourbon pioneers. In 1984, in honor of the Colonel and his love for tradition, the distillery made history with the world's first single-barrel bourbon to be marketed commercially. It's been more than 2 centuries since those first heroic pioneers struggled to survive in the fledgling settlement of Leestown. At Buffalo Trace Distillery, we endeavor to honor the great sacrifices of the brave souls that sought to open new worlds. We seek to capture their drive, their spirit, and their determination in the authentic, high-quality whiskeys produced at Buffalo Trace. In the last 10 years alone, our bourbons have earned more than 40 top distinctions in national and international competitions, and our labels are called for in countries around the world. This legacy lives on in our namesake bourbon, Buffalo Trace Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. The legends, the heroes, the leaders, their spirits are still here at Buffalo Trace Distillery. At Buffalo Trace, you'll find tribute to the freedom and independence they sought, to the power and beauty of a wilderness past, and to the dauntless buffalo whose ancient trails open new worlds for us all.